But now the hidden magic of your hometown, revealed for 50 pence or a pound. There are summer walks and guided tours all over the northwest. We joined a couple of sample tours of the city of Liverpool.
Well, the building behind me is called Union House. It was until recently the Liverpool office of a very large, important company, the Union Coal Storage Company. And the story of that firm is really the story of one family, the Vesti family. In 1860, Samuel Vesti, who was a provision merchant, had his office here in Temple Court, just a few yards behind you. And he had 6 sons. His eldest son, William, was sent across to the United States to buy commodities for his father. And in fact, his son eventually took over the business. He did so well that at the age of 30, he was able to retire. And he built himself a large house in Freshfield, a few miles north of Liverpool. And that could have been the end of his working life. But 5 years or so of retirement was really too much. He was a bit bored with sitting around in his large new house. So he decided to go across the Atlantic again, this time to Argentina, because he had the idea of shipping meat in volume, refrigerating meat, which is something that had only been done on a very small scale before. And he bought up large tracts of land, he built refrigeration plants, and he founded a shipping line, the Blue Star Line, to bring the frozen meat across to Liverpool. This building behind me was their Liverpool office.
Away behind me there, you can see the spire of St. Nicholas's Church. Now, St. Nicholas's has been on that spot since the 1300s and has had a very checkered history. What we are looking at now is the lantern spire. And the interesting story there happened in 1810 when one February morning the children from the local church school had filed into the church. The rector apparently stood aside to let the children go in, and there was a sudden bang and crash, and the spire fell into the church, bringing most of the tower down with it, and killed 27 people inside, of whom 22 were children from the church schools. Now, the reason for this crash was because in the early 1700s, the council in Liverpool, seeing that the town was getting more and more important, felt that the squat 15th century tower of St. Nicholas was not really imposing enough, so they added a tall spire on top of it about 1725. Now, they were warned at the time that the old tower was not too safe, but you know what these corporations, these councils are. They thought, well, we'll take the risk. We want something people can see when they come into the river. So they stuck this spire on top of the tower. Well, it took just about 100 years before it fell down. Now, beyond St. Nicholas's, you can just see the monument for the engine room staffs of ships which either sank by hitting icebergs or were sunk by torpedoes during war and peace. It was built, of course, as a monument to the stokers, the engine room staff of the Titanic, but they changed it to the engine room staffs of all ships.
We're now standing at the bottom of Matthew Street, and this is an area of Liverpool that has really been transformed out of all recognition in the last few years. It was very much the centre of the fruit trade. The warehouse across the road, now called Flanagan's Apple, was originally a fruit warehouse and provisions warehouse, stocked with goods from all over the world. It's now recently reopened as a new pub called Flanagan's Apple, as you can see. And many people think this is a reference to the Beatles, because people come to Matthew Street from all over the world, because higher up the street is the site of the Cavern Club, where, of course, the Beatles played on nearly 300 occasions. The owners, though, assure us that the reference to Apple wasn't to the Apple core, the Beatles company, but in fact to the building's origins, its origins as an Apple warehouse.
Right, well, here we are in the courtyard of the Atlantic Tower Hotel. And the main reason probably for coming in here is to see this beautiful statue. What pleases me very much is that the company who built the hotel were prepared to commission a statue of something that you can easily recognize. I suppose I'm old-fashioned, but I'm not too keen on some of these modern statues where you have to ask, what does it mean? Well, it's fairly obvious what these are. They are a column of greater black-backed gulls rising up from the Atlantic Ocean. And the whole column actually swings to and fro in high winds.
Well, we've now arrived outside the Cavern Club here in Matthew Street. The Beatles performed here, or rather in the original Cavern Club, a total of 292 times. Bob Wooler, the old disc jockey, kept a tally because he could see the potential that was there. But at the time, the Beatles hadn't been heard of anywhere other than here in Liverpool. 10 years ago, the building we see today didn't exist. There was an old warehouse here, and in fact, the Cavern Club was in the cellar of that warehouse. It had once been a cheese cellar, and it must surely be the most famous cheese cellar in the world. 10 years ago, the old warehouse was pulled down. British Rail needed to get down underground to construct a tunnel linking the northern and southern suburban railway lines underneath the city centre. The warehouse was demolished and a car park took its place after the railway construction work was complete. The smell, the one thing they haven't managed to recreate in the new development is the smell of the old Cavern Club. It was a cheese warehouse, and the smell there has been described as a mixture of cheese rinds, sweat, perfume and disinfectant.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Thomas Beattie's, one of Liverpool's last surviving independent wine merchants, founded by Thomas Beattie in 1827. The cellars are on 2 levels. This is the first level, and then you go down to the next level down below, where I held all our stock, plus also customer reserves of vintage port and clarets. This room is euphemistically referred to as the bin room, where we keep many everyday wines plus extras. On the left-hand side here, you can see Petit Chateau clarets, referred to as the Englishman's wine, because it's still very popular. And being a traditional wine merchants, we have a lot of Petit Chateau clarets. This is Quinta de Novel, 1970. Vintage port is port of 1 year that's bottled 2 years after the vintage, and it matures in bottle as opposed to wood port that matures in wood. We're going to have a tasting now of Beattie's House Moselle, which is Deutsche Tafelwein, which is a nice, crisp, fresh, medium dry white. It should go down very well on a nice warm day like today.
Well, we're looking over the heart of Liverpool's historic dockland. And this is the oldest part of the Liverpool dock system. The docks in front of you all date back into the 18th century. Now, the 18th century was a very lawless and violent time. I know Mrs. Thatcher says Liverpool has a long history of violence, but actually the 18th century was, I suppose, the most violent time. The terror, you might say, of all men in a city like Liverpool was, of course, the press gang. Now, in those days, the Royal Naval ships used to hang around on the entrances to the Mersey, and any incoming ship was liable to be boarded and members of the crew taken off and impressed into the Royal Navy. You had no choice, you had to go. Of course, there were people who were not to be impressed, such as whalers and carpenters. And I'm going to tell you the story of a whaling ship. Now, you've got to imagine out there where you can see those cranes is Laird's Yard. And imagine you're back in 1759 and lying out there in the river, more or less where you see that slipway going down, is a ship, HMS Vengeance, very aptly named. Now, coming up the river slowly is a very fine whaler known as the Golden Lion. the Golden Lion, the pride of the Liverpool Greenland whaling fleet, is coming home having been months in the Arctic. Her crew are all anxious to get home. Liverpool is a small town. Standing on the deck, they can almost see their homes. They can even see their wives and sweethearts waiting to greet them. Vengeance lowers a cutter which rows smartly across to the Golden Lion and pulls up alongside. The officer in the stern of the cutter stands up and says, "Any volunteers for the Royal Navy?" Well, the whalers, first of all, cannot be impressed, and secondly, they've had, say, 4 or 5 months in the Arctic. Their wives and sweethearts are waiting on the quay, so you can imagine what the whalers' reply was. Short, sharp, and to the point. And when I say to the point, I mean it, because they drew their knives for cutting blubber, their axes, and as the cutter's men swarmed aboard, there was a short, sharp fight, and the cutter's men were flung back into the cutter. The captain of the Vengeance, who was a particularly nasty type, then ordered his master gunner to fire a couple of rounds at the Golden Lion. He did that, he missed the Golden Lion, but the shots landed in this area here, which in those days was crowded with small houses. Didn't kill anybody, but did quite a lot of damage and upset the local populace very much. And at that time, there was a pier sticking out into the river. You came in through here, into this dock, and then into the old dock. But there was a long pier sticking out, and the Captain Thompson of the Golden Lion said to his men, "We'll pull up to the pier, you jump off and you run like hell to the customs house, which is the back of the old dock. There we will find a magistrate who will say, you're not to be impressed." The cutter's men followed and ran even faster to the customs house. And they smashed down the doors and got inside. Well, most of the whalers jumped out of the windows at the back and disappeared into the small streets behind the customs house. But 5 of them, including the captain, were caught, and they were dragged back to the pier to be thrown into the cutter and to take on board HMS Vengeance. But the populace at times got very tired of these press gangs, and they turned on them and they joined in the fight, and as a result the men from the Vengeance were fairly badly hurt and flung into their cutter and told to make their way back.
History lives, okay. Those summer guided tours cost £1 for adults, 50p for youngsters, and they happen, as you saw, in Liverpool, but also in Manchester, Southport and on the Wirral. Consult your local tourist office.